Okay. We're ready to go on critique 2ACs and kind of thinking about, as soon as I actually get my document up. Okay. I'm going to try and give what I think are some, general principles for thinking about writing critical 2ACs or, 2ACs to critiques. Kind of talk a little bit about setting up the strategy. My focal point here is going to be kind of the presumption that this is, an affirmative with a plan, writing, F arguments for their 2AC, but I can cover some additional areas as well if people have questions about those or sort of applying those to a different context in which you've written an AF that is more critically oriented or maybe a critical defense of a particular plan, okay? So the first thing to think about here is that you need, as with any position, you need a variety of 2AC arguments. Okay, like variety is an important strategic principle because you need to make sure that the negative has a fair amount that they need to address. Okay, most kind of K2ACs that I see are far too narrow, or they introduce only a few relatively predictable arguments. Okay, that make it extremely easy for the negative to stay mostly on their blocks to kind of have the debate largely in hand and extremely well prepared throughout the course of the block and kind of even setting up kind of their 2 in our strategy. So you want to think about this from the perspective of what you need to do to challenge the negative to debate differently, to kind of add some things that are not, totally prepared elements, or at least that introduce some wrinkles or some challenges that they haven't had to deal with before. Otherwise, this is a set of positions that the negative kind of inherently has some advantages on in terms of their ability to pre-prepare and to block out their strategy. Okay, I'm sure people are familiar with some of the kind of effects of that. The most common bottleneck that I notice in the 2AC and kind of the principle that I want you to think about the most thoroughly is that you need to make arguments that don't all depend upon winning the plan as the focus of the debate. Okay. Most K2ACs start with a theoretical argument about either plan focus, right? Everybody labels this as framework. I think that it might be more accurate to label it as plan focus if that's the kind of way that you're asserting that the framework for the debate is about the unique effects of the plan. Okay, but regardless of what you call it, okay, if that's a significant point of kind of 2AC development, the real problem is that the rest of the 2AC cannot or should not be dependent upon winning that argument. Okay. Why? 1, if you win that argument, the chances are that you should be able to win absent other, like you don't need much else in the debate if you can win theoretically that the judge is evaluating only the unique consequences of the plan, right? Most kind of principles of critical strategy revolve around defeating plan focus or changing the framework for the debate. Yeah. So like in theory, that means that if the AF wins that particular argument, there really shouldn't be a ton that the negative has set up their own strategy to do well. Okay. Same thing with kind of like, then what you're really talking about is that the neg needs to win a disadvantage, right? It's like if we're evaluating only the unique effects of the plan, then instead of debating a critique that kind of has different ways of getting out of the burden of uniqueness, right? If those ways are gone, then the chances that any of the kind of critique links or impacts are unique is extremely low, right? Most other elements of critical strategy are written to get around uniqueness. Are we on the same page on that? Okay. What this means, it's like plan focus and uniqueness are kind of 2 sides of the same coin, right? The judge only evaluates the unique consequences of the plan versus the status quo, a counterplan or an alternative, right? Most AF permutation arguments in particular are phrased as though the AF is going to win the plan as the focus of the debate. Okay, like most of you, when you write or kind of think about permutation strategy in your K2AC, you are thinking about it in terms of the plan. Okay, so for example, when debating a security critique alternative that we'll imagine for our purposes is something is phrased as kind of like reject the logic of securitization or something something that's very broad, right? That is about the way in which we approach the problem of security. Most K2ACs that I see, the permutation arguments, and there are often several of them, are phrased essentially as get rid of all security plus the plan, and quote, the alternative overcomes the remainder of the link arguments, okay? And so the residual link to the plan is irrelevant, and that's the explanation of the permutation. How many of you have made or given this explanation of a critical permutation? Raise your hand. Okay. I want to suggest that that is not the right way to think about any of these permutation strategies, okay? Any K2AC permutation should treat the alternative as different from a counterplan, okay? As different from kind of plan-focused debate. Do you see how that permutation text or that permutation concept is really designed around the way in which the plan is the focus of the debate, because it assumes that the only link arguments that the negative makes or that the negative can win are all link arguments about the plan, right? If the negative wins their framework arguments that the plan is not the focus of the debate, that permutation is phrased in a way that cannot be explained in the negative's framework. It can only be explained in a plan-focused framework, meaning that your permutation is now duplicative with any of your plan-focused framework arguments. See how that works, right? And it's duplicative in a way that also, like, it detracts even more time than duplication might otherwise, because that permutation is intended to be something that would be an entirely separate 2AR strategy, but you've now linked them together in a way that means that the 1AR can't go for one unless they go for the other. So you have locked like two of your most important arguments have been locked together in a way that eliminates any 1AR diversity for those kind of important arguments, okay? The way that you want to think about this then is, what if the negative were to win their framework argument, okay? What would that mean for how we would think about or explain a permutation? Okay, so give me an example of a negative framework argument that you feel like you've had difficulty debating, or that you've heard somebody make and be successful with. Like, what's a negative framework argument that if you were to lose right now, you feel like you would not be able to explain a permutation? Give me an example. Yeah.
Like, role of the ballot is to reject capitalism in debate.
Okay, so that framework argument, right, that says here, what you're doing is you see how it's like, that framework argument is really an impact argument. It's really an argument about which impacts count. If your permutation is being explained in a way that is, that essentially, let's take an example of a permutation strategy versus capitalism, okay, that's being phrased in that way. Your permutation might be something like, only reformist strategies can end capitalism. We don't want a revolutionary strategy. We need to, use some of our existing economic tools as a way to kind of transcend capitalism, or here are some of the regulations that we might offer that are, a regulated version of capitalism is better. What you're really trying to do there is explain the combination of either assumptions, right, tools, methods, whatever other terminology that the negative has introduced into the debate. Can those things be combined? Not the plan text and the alternative text, but elements of the 1AC that the negative reads links about and the 1NC alternative. Okay, so some of this is about kind of in writing your blocks for these arguments or thinking about 2AC prep. You need to write at least one permutation that utilizes some of the terminology of the negatives framework argument, okay, while explaining your claim, right? Another example here might be something like, we need to test the epistemic assumptions of the affirmative, right? Or, we need to test the ontological assumptions of the affirmative. We should not evaluate only the effects of the plan. We should evaluate instead the way that the kind of 1AC's epistemology commits us to a particular view of the world. Yeah, how many of you have heard an argument, something like that? Yeah, okay. So in that circumstance, your permutation needs to be phrased in terms of epistemology. How is it that we could combine, or why should we combine different epistemic assumptions or different epistemic techniques, okay? And what is the effect of combining them? Jim, oh, go ahead.
I have a question for like those types of critiques. Like, if they how would you recommend like the most ideal way to respond to like the next answer to like your firm, if they're like, you can't like sever the representations that you've already forwarded via the 1AC.
Yeah, so you see how it's like, we're already starting to pile on potentially some of the terms that the neg might use here, okay? We'll get to one of the things that I think is important here for thinking about 2AC stuff is how you set up some of these arguments in the cross-X. So I want to kind of save that for a moment. But if you think about like the way that you just use the terminology of representations, right? That is a way of changing the debate from plan focus to the 1AC, right? Now the AF is not responsible only for the effects, or kind of the judge is not only evaluating the effects of the plan, right? In comparison to the status quo, they're evaluating the effects of speaking the 1AC, right? So your permutation argument needs to include, rather than like, let me put it this way, all of the arguments in which perms are about the plan text already are debating that severance issue, because what you're really having a debate about is just whether or not the plan is the focus of the debate, which is it's like, this is exactly why not to have that debate as like, it's duplicated on the framework and the permutation. Does that make sense, right? Do you see how that, like, that's a significant problem for the AF, because it also means that if you allocate coverage to those things, not only are they locked together in the 1AR, but like the 1AR generally, I think, is held to a standard where they have to repeat a lot of those arguments, as opposed to like, it will sound sort of silly for you to combine those arguments to say just like, oh, group the framework and the permutation, right? Like those were supposed to be separate. Now you're putting them back together, right? So you need to keep them separate for purposes of time and strategy. And like, instead of thinking about it from the perspective of how do we, quote, justify severance or argue that severance is not present for this permutation because we are only responsible for defending the plan, it's like, leave that argument to plan focus. Don't make that as part of your perm. Instead, the perm can be explained as, because they have won that what we are evaluating is whether or not these assumptions can be combined, right? Or these representational strategies, for instance, can be combined, okay? There are some of these criticisms where the permutation is not a great strategy, right? So like, you know, one of, just as a kind of classic or ubiquitous example right now, Afro-pessimism is designed to make any permutation impossible, right? Like that whole unflinching paradigmatic analysis thing, right? It's like, it is designed to defeat any permutation strategy. A perm in that instance in your 2AC is in there primarily as a distraction or as a way to get the negative to spend time rather than as your 2AR strategy, okay? But in some circumstances, like, you know, the security K that uses some of this language of representations or discourse, right? There are cards that talk about the kind of combination or the ability to, you know, deal with different permutations of different sets of assumptions, for instance, in international relations theory. So in thinking a little bit about what permutation strategy looks like in that world, you want to think about what a card might say, or what sets of, you know, evidence you could draw on to make those arguments about combination, okay? I want to suggest a few kind of terms or kind of ways to think about that with regards to epistemology and ontology in particular, okay? One is the notion of eclecticism, okay? So like, rather than making a kind of prior choice about one epistemic assumption or one epistemic method that is superior, right? Or one ontological account of the world, okay? There are a set of people in international relations who defend the concept of eclecticism. That is, we can draw from a bunch of different sources, okay? Most of them make the claim that a, quote, foundationalist perspective on international relations theory, okay, is one that is unproductive. It is unproductive to make a foundational claim about international relations. I want to define both of these terms to kind of help you think about how this would play out strategically. So foundationalism, right? Just think about this, the image of construction, which is the metaphor that's trying on, right? What's the foundation?
Cement at the bottom, or new thing on top of.
Okay, why do you have a foundation? What's the role of a foundation?
To build off of.
Okay, it's the thing that it's like, you build everything else on top of the foundation, right? You got to have the foundation like all set and ready to go before anything else can be built, okay? Think about that as the metaphor for the ways in which many negative critiques explain their arguments about epistemology or ontology, right? It's like, we have to get this thing right, and then everything else follows from that. It's the foundational claim. Does that map on some ways that people hear these positions explained, right? It's like, think about this as epistemology first or ontology first is being phrased in a foundationalist way. It's first because you have to do it prior or before everything else, okay? There are many people who criticize this account of how we would make decisions. In part, like most of the people who support some version of eclecticism, okay, another term that you might use here is pragmatism, okay, are trying to make the argument that foundationalism in these areas is not possible, that we cannot build a like entirely set or accurate foundation before we do anything else, because the world is too complex to be reduced to one set of either techniques for observing it or one set of entities. So like that, the first one was epistemology, the second one is ontology, one set of entities, okay, for how the world works. Okay? And they generally make the claim that if we begin to kind of make this foundationalist, or another term that is connected here is reductionist, okay, to reduce everything to one question or to one entity, one variable, okay, that foundationalist or reductionist approaches to international relations end up producing a number of, one, theoretical inaccuracies. So like, no, the world is far more complicated than that. We cannot reduce the world to one foundational observation. Two, that if you think about foundational observational claims about our world, like they are the things that there is no one continuous foundational observation of the world that we have thus found that is totally correct. Okay, it's just like there's no theoretical account of the world that we can say has been correct. And so putting all of our eggs in one basket for the future about that is likely to make us make a series of dangerous or inaccurate choices or decisions. And that's the kind of set of people who are discussing then a permutation argument that doesn't depend upon winning plan focus, right? And in fact, provides a justification for we should attempt to, instead of answer one foundational question about ontology or epistemology, make a mixed or tested series of observations using different techniques, different methods, combine them together. It changes the threshold for the way in which the link to a permutation should be assessed. Because the concept that combining some part of the 1AC that is incompatible with a different epistemic approach or a different ontological assumption, right? It's like it shouldn't be thrown out because we can't essentially filter everything through the one prior or foundational claim. Okay? That obviously is a permutation strategy that only support, like you can't go for only that argument in the 2AR, okay? But the 2AC at least then has set up an option where you can begin to explain some of your case impact as well as your alternative solvency indites, okay, together into a package where you don't have to win that the plan is the focus of the debate. Your whole objective here is just to make sure that there's at least more than one 2AR strategy in your K2AC, okay? That's kind of thinking about changing your approach to permutations, right? Same thing with then the way that we would, it's like implicit in that discussion is that you would also change your approach to the notion of severance or intrinsicness, right? Because severance and intrinsicness operate differently if the plan isn't the focus of the debate. I think I've kind of covered that already, but you could ask questions about that if necessary. So all of this kind of, one of the things that I mentioned that I wanted to do a thread on cross-X here, okay? And we've been speaking rather abstractly about some of these, kind of what critique we might be debating. I think it's important to not think of those as the K, or there's only one of them. There are a lot of different ones. And most 2ACs that I see in these debates really don't seem like they were altered at all by the course of cross-X. Okay, so how many of you have asked a cross-X question something like, well, what does the world of the alternative look like? Raise your hand if you have asked a question that is basically a variation on that. Okay, how often has that helped you? Layla, you say it has.
Yeah.
When?
Like specific, I can't think of specific rounds, but I've had multiple times when you ask what does the world of the alternative look like? And it's either something that's extremely conducive to a perm or it's something that's extremely vague, which helps with all fails.
Okay, so what you're getting at there is, I think the best possible outcome for that round of questions is like that it's a question that can't really be answered, right? Which is like you're hoping for the like, oh, they could, you're basically hoping for a version of the arguments like they couldn't even answer this question, right? And it's like then your permutation is some version of, well, we don't really understand what this alternative is. We kind of understand what the plan gets us, like we're good to go. Is that?
Well, yes, but then also sometimes like they do answer it and their explanation is just like there's like a way to like work it into like a perm with the app. Like at least like one example is like on like through like the securitization kit. The way that they explained like the alternative was like we should assess, like we should study things before we evaluate if they're a threat or something.
Okay.
Which is like
That
That's
not
really
a
an outline.
not a great alternative answer, right? I think that what we're getting at here is maybe it seemed like the rest of you agreed that this question has generally not led you where you want to go, right? And I'm using this as an example of like, it sounds like that wasn't a great answer, right? Not a great debate. So like in the circumstance in which it works, you are already in probably a winning position, right? If you're debating a team that is explaining the security K as the study counter plan, I agree with you that that's we're in good spot. Okay. So why is it that question's like, why do you keep asking that question if it does not get you anything?
Sometimes, so like I'll alleviate confusion about the critique.
Okay, so the way that you think that you get a very specific answer about something that seems unclear is to ask the really open-ended version of the question?
Well, like, I mean, sometimes like I have no idea whatsoever what the critique does. Like it's something that
Okay.
I've never seen before. And so like asking a question about what the world of the alternative looks like, I feel like sometimes helps me. Like not that much because they don't really ever explain it that well. But
Okay.
sometimes it'll help me like see potentially like what the critique, like what it's trying to aim at, what it's trying to accomplish.
Okay, like I agree that that's what you want, right? Like I totally understood that what you're trying to get at there is basically like, are there places where I could make, other offensive arguments, right? Other no solvency arguments, or at the very least explain the alternative in relationship to the case a little bit more clearly, right? That's what you're trying to get.
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, I guess sometimes just to clarify, like make sure they're not doing tricks, like you'd ask if the alternate.
Okay. Any tricks? So we gotta stop the tricks. You think that the way that the negative answers that question is usually going to make that very clear?
Well, I mean, like usually we just ask like, is the alternate or like is the alternate? It would just be like yes.
Yes or no? Okay. I think that part of what I want you to be thinking about is your 2AC one should change based on the cross-X. Like the cross-X needs to matter. Many of them, like we're not even at the, like we've already discussed the ways in which we're not getting a lot out of this, right? Second, that most of the time that I see the, 1A ask this set of questions, the 2A stands up and like, even if we got somewhere in that cross-X, literally nothing has changed in the 2AC block. How many of you have had that experience? Okay, so like in general, okay, I would err in favor of 2AC prep time / cross-X thoroughness on this set of issues over 2AR prep time, okay? The great strategic fear that you're discussing, which is that you will be debating an alternative that you do not understand, okay? Having more 2AR prep time does not help you in that situation, right? They're like, oh, I finally understood what the negatives alternative argument was during my, 7 minutes of 2AR prep. And as a result, I got to make a series of new arguments, none of which really mattered. And that was a big problem, okay? So I think that altering the 2AC block based on this set of questions and based on the results of cross-X, very important. Cross-X questions, okay, should be raised in terms that focus the set of things that you need to know to give this 2AC. So, for instance, the open-ended version of the question, what does the world of the alternative look like, okay, or if you think about some of these epistemology or ontology related questions, the open-ended versions of those are like, well, like, if you ask what is the framework for the debate, how many of you got an answer that's something like, well, the app just needs to justify their representations, or we need to evaluate representations prior to everything else? How many of you have gotten an answer like that? Okay. How many of you have asked a follow-up question on, well, what does it mean to justify a representation or an assumption? Anybody ask that question? Okay, so the second level question, you see how that's not the open-ended one, it's the one that demands an actual answer, okay? So for instance, if asked, kind of like, well, we're criticizing the affirmative's epistemic assumptions, how many of you have also asked the reverse side of that question? So it's like, so what epistemological assumption or what epistemological foundation should we use? Right? Do you see how that, instead of asking the open-ended question, what is the, what does the world of the alternative look like, or what, any of these that are very, very broad, try to get the negative to specify their answer in terms of their framework. So if they say that the framework for the debate is, to evaluate epistemic assumptions, okay, they should be able to answer the question, well, what epistemic assumptions are employed, or what epistemic techniques or criteria, there are a variety of words you could put in there. What epistemic criteria are you using under the alternative, right? Or what alternative epistemic criteria are you introducing, right? So ask some of the questions in the same way that I was trying to say you want a permutation strategy that assumes that you're not winning your plan focus argument. You also need to ask some of those questions in relationship to their alternative, right? Because the basic strategic difficulty that the AF is encountering here is that most alternatives, right, the set of people that we're drawing upon for these critiques, there is not a lot of overlap or common language with the set of people that we're reading for our NATO security cooperation 1ACs, right? So if you think about the Brooks presentation, right, on kind of deep engagement and forward presence, right? If you think about it, that presentation, is attempts to provide a very broad overview, like a grand strategic justification for the US alliance system, right? So parts of that lecture are basically built into most of the 1ACs that write a NATO key advantage, right? So a bunch of those arguments you should be fairly thoroughly familiar with. If you raised your hand and you asked a question of Professor Brooks, it's just so, there's been a lot of work in critical international relations on the role that racial formations played on the historical development of international relations and the epistemic criteria of the social sciences. What do you think his answer to that question, or it's what do you think we should do about that, or what does that have to do with deep engagement? What do you think his answer to that question would be? I think it would probably be something like, that's not really the field of study that I'm in, right? I've read maybe he's read, and I'm sorry, I'm not trying to imply that just oh yeah, Brooks is he's a very smart guy, reads a lot, but just his subfield of international relations and grand strategy. Remember when he was oh, there's 40 scholars who kind of write in this debate, and I wanted to research and kind of produce an alternative account as part of this debate, right? It's that gives you a clue of sort of the parameters that this person is reading most deeply in, right? And the set of kind of research projects that they're engaged in kind of all assume that you're in dialogue using a common set of disciplinary assumptions. The K strategies that we're talking about introduce, kind of questions or challenges that are so different that it is no surprise that these cross-ex exchanges are kind of the ways that you're trying to get some of these arguments in dialogue, or at least, related to one another, are extremely difficult, okay? So, part of the reason to ask the cross-ex questions in terms of the negatives framework argument is so that you get an answer that makes sense on its own terms, okay? So always asking the alternative question as though it is a counterplan that works exactly the same way that you were planning to debate, right? Once again, making an assumption about the set of asks that we're talking about here. But that can only get you so far. The kind of set of questions that I think are most neglected here for setting up the 2AC is a question about the alternative framework for the debate, okay? So when I was saying that kind of second line question, right, of, so what epistemic criteria should we employ? Or what are the ontological foundations that your alternative uses? You see how it's like that question asks a question about their alternative in terms of their framework argument. Yeah.
So you said like what epistemic criteria should we employ and what ontological what was the second question that you like suggested?
I said something like, what are the ontological assumptions that we should make, or what ontological foundations should we use, right?
And you think that would like help like set up the 2AC in a better spot to answer like the critique, like you would be able to have better answers based on the questions to the critique specifically.
Well, for one, the negative needs to be able to answer let me put it this way. If the negative can't answer a question about what epistemic technique or, kind of criteria they are employing or what ontological foundations they are using, and they are also trying to say that either epistemology or ontology are the core issues for the debate, right? That's when you were like, oh, sometimes they can't explain their own argument, kind of Layla said that too, right? They're like, oh, one of the ways that the negative can end up here is not being able to explain their argument very well, right? Most of these questions are right now asymmetrically asked of the affirmative, and they are very difficult to answer. So like giving a 1 minute response to like, okay, justify the social sciences, right? Which is kind of the like embedded part of some of these questions on the neg side, okay? A version of that question never gets asked of the negative, okay? So the reason that I'm suggesting that changes what the 2AC can do is by asking those questions in terms of the negatives framework, you are also getting at some of the ways in which you can begin to apply evidence that otherwise isn't in like, easy dialogue or, like you're not going to find in these defenses of liberalism as a grand strategy, right? Or defenses of security communities in the case of NATO, like a bunch of the different kind of international relations AF cards that you're going to be researching. Those cards aren't going to say like NATO within 10 Virilio fails, okay? Like that card doesn't exist, okay? So in order to make any of the 2AC arguments actually apply to the negatives framework, you need to know in advance of giving the 2AC what they're going to suggest. If you always only include in the 2AC your planned focus argument, right? And then the neg's got the block, they have their like, here's what we're doing instead of planned focus, right? The 1AR is almost impossible to cover in a bunch of these debates where you have to both kind of generate new offense versus the negative position that's just been introduced, right? Their framework, okay? And, explain or justify your own. So moving that up to, cross-ex of the 1NC and actually changing the 2AC based upon the answers to those questions, like a 2AC that incorporates some of those answers and tries to like use the terminology that the negative has used, okay, means that the 1AR actually doesn't have to generate all of those arguments on their own. Yeah.
And do you think like this type of like language or like these arguments should go like be distributed throughout the 2AC, or should like do you recommend adding things on framework? Or
I think different from framework. So like the framework argument, if your framework argument is planned focus, that part doesn't change a lot from debate to debate, right? Like you could incorporate a card there that sort of says something like, evaluating the consequences of policy helps us, test epistemic or ontological assumptions, right? That style of card exists that basically is like where you're trying to, like usually those debates boil down to some version of the AF is making a theoretical claim about debatability and fairness, right? Whereas the neg is making a, like we could summarize it as education or some kind of claim essentially about why we need to know differently, how we need to know things differently. Yeah, we on the same page there. Okay, so the one card that you might adapt or change there is a 2AC card that says, if we debate kind of consequences of particular actions, that helps us learn or kind of generate, better information or knowledge about the things that you say that we need, substantively to engage with educationally. Okay, so it's defense to their framework impact, right? Where you're going for your offense based on fairness or debatability. Yeah, but that's the one part of that that's likely to change. Okay, The parts that are likely to change are the negatives explanation, right? And that's the part where I rarely see the 2AC incorporate any information about that, or it's just like, maybe the 2AC reads the same kind of like, you know, shouldn't make epistemology prior, or like, you know, predictions good. That like that style card, that's the one card that makes it in there that has any possible relationship to the negatives framework argument. Yeah. Instead, what you want to be looking for is a card that has been applied and re-tagged for the 2AC based on cross-ex answers about what the framework for the debate ought to be.
So like, I've been in debates before where like, I'll ask a cross-ex question, like, okay, they'll answer with like, I reject the premise of that question. In a situation like that, if you, do you think like asking those like more direct questions, like, would they still like, I was asking questions about the alternative, and I was like, in this scenario, like, what would the alternative do? And I mean, granted, it was like last year, and I hadn't heard of these questions before, but they were like, I reject the premise of that question. You're like falling within the society norms that the K is advocating against. Like, what do you say in a situation like? And at that point, I was like, okay, but I didn't know what to say. Like, what do you say in a situation like that?
Well, so for one, like building in some premises to your questions, fine. Like they're well within their rights to say like, well, the premise of that question is, you know, inaccurate, or I can't deal with the premise of that because, okay. But anything that is used to shift or question the premise of a question can also become a new argument that you are making about something else. Okay, so like for instance, let's imagine one of the like, you know, imagine our kind of IR security generic, right? So the Falk alternative card there that is basically a kind of cosmopolitan cooperation multilateralism style card. Yeah. Okay. What if the cross-ex question there is, instead of, well, what does the alternative look like? It is, does the alternative mean that we end sanctions on Russia? Does the alternative mean that, you know, the US can no longer send arms to Ukraine? Does the alternative mean that we need to cooperate with Russia at all costs? Right? Do you see how it's like you're asking their questions that are related to the case, they are related to the alternative. They don't ask it in an open-ended fashion. They ask it in a directed fashion that would allow you. Now, keep in mind, in order for those questions to truly have an impact, you need to have cards that then, let's say the answer is like, part of the answer there should be yes, right? It's just chances are like that fault card that says kind of like, we need to, there's, you know, another card in there on like, we need to support Ukrainian peace activists, or, you know, civil society actors in Ukraine who, you know, call on both the US and Russia to do comprehensive peace negotiations. You need to have some cards that are just like, you know, peaceful negotiations with Russia have broken down, or like Russia's negotiating, you know, like you would want to have some cards that actually back up the stuff that you're asking about. But you see how it's like, if the negative has no answer to those more directed questions, or the answer is something like, I reject the, like, okay, the scenario you've asked about, I reject the premise of that question, okay? Well, the premise of that question is that we need to make some decisions based on, you know, kind of current phenomena in foreign policy, right? And so if that premise gets, if that's the premise that gets rejected, part of the way that I would explain the alternative solvency arguments in the 2AC is to reference the cross-ex and say, they rejected the premise that we need to make a decision about what to do about, you know, the conflict between Russia and Ukraine. Rejecting that premise, or not having an answer there, means, you know, like then there are a number of arguments that you can apply there. Implies appeasement of Russia, or like, you know, means that it is not about support. Like there are many cards that I'm sure you could read right now on like various kind of leftist opinion columnists who say, it is important to understand that even though we have to challenge the US in certain circumstances on its foreign policy, like, you know, Ukraine is a moral issue for the support for the Ukrainian people, or something like that, right? Those are cards that you could easily find. Yeah?
Yeah.
Okay. So like that set of more directed questions that relates both to phenomena that are connected to the case, and that if the alternative answer is I reject the premise, well, okay, it's fine if you reject that premise, but there are consequences that follow from rejecting that premise, right? It's like, this implies a worldview in which we do not need to make decisions based on present phenomena. Here are the problems with that worldview, either in terms of the scenario that we articulated, or it's in terms of some of the original case impacts. Yeah? Okay. You know, one of the other things that you're thinking about in terms of a couple of these is you want to try and ask like a more general kind of problem with 2AC strategy here for any of these critical positions, okay, to kind of get back to the larger theme, okay. The AF is threading a needle usually between defending a significant shift in policy, okay, like including potentially what is regarded as politically likely. It's a little bit less the case with this topic. Like part of the reason that there's not much uniqueness is that actually it is well within the realm of political possibility that the US increases security cooperation with NATO, yeah. But you're at least, it's a significant shift in a specific policy decision, okay? But you're trying to explain that as like an important change with this large impact at the same time that you're basically saying there's a lot about our politics that shouldn't be changed, right? It's like you're both making the case for change, as in we must make this set of policy alterations with regards to NATO and security cooperation. And at the same time, you've got this big backdrop of stuff that is not likely to change, right? That's that kind of grand strategy lecture from Brooks, right? The like, if you think about the way that he gave that lecture, that core assumptions of deep engagement, okay, are generally shared by the vast majority of the US national security establishment, right? And he was interested in developing criteria for judging deep engagement versus deep engagement plus, right? Or like, those were all formulated in terms of like retooling specific policy choices, right? Like not questioning the broader assumption of grand strategy. The biggest that we got there was restraint versus deep engagement, yeah, which is pretty big, but it's like, is still, in terms of some of these criticisms that we're reading, a much more narrow confine, yeah? And so you have to be able to both, when you talk about defending or justifying assumptions, what you're really doing there is making sure that the 2AC includes both arguments that, one, defend the specific change that is necessary, and two, defend the background that's not being changed, okay? So like one of the set of 2AC blocks that almost, certainly needs very significant development from you going into this year is a defense of deep engagement, of forward presence, right? Like part of the reason that we had that as a topic lecture is that if you think about that as like most critiques have to have some kind of inroad or like something to say about that part of the larger set of assumptions that inform this policy change, right? The basic assumption is that most of these AFs are in order to have a NATO key warrant, they have some version of this helps NATO work better, right? Cohesion, or like this helps NATO's military effectiveness, interoperability, right? But all clearly rest on the premise that what is desirable is a more effective NATO, yeah? So the 2AC that only defends the kind of, everybody wants, this is part of the broader theme of thinking about it beyond plan focus, right? It's like, everybody wants to think about this just in terms of, well, the plan's change has these, very big impacts that we are defending that are like, our existential risk outweighs your K, okay? You can't get away with only thinking about that always in terms of the plan. You have to think about it in terms of a larger theoretical defense of the backdrop of assumptions or kind of foundations on which the 1AC rests, okay? So a defense of deep engagement, of liberal internationalism, of I think that, too many times I see teams asked about their 2AC where it's like, they haven't read any cards that really got into that set of background assumptions. They are only trying to defend this in terms of like, this is the kind of very particular change that we are making, okay? So think about the 2AC, including things that are very much not changed by the AF, right? It's like most of those, since these K frameworks are designed to debate things outside this kind of the realm or the scope of uniqueness, you need to be thinking about it outside the realm or the scope of uniqueness too. All of your kind of scenarios from the advantage are very much the like unique consequences of the plan, but most of what you will actually be debating for a lot of these impact arguments is defending the things that are not unique consequences of the plan. They are instead, historical or kind of deep assumptions that are embedded in the things that make the plan seem desirable, okay? A few other kind of things that you want to be thinking about here. Sorry, my coverage here in this particular 2AC is pretty poor, but we'll see what we can do. Defending plan focus and defending fiat, not the same thing, or not exactly the same thing, okay? So your plan focus theory argument is not the same thing as defending why it is that we ought to imagine changes to US policy. I think there are a set of cards that defend the kind of process of learning political or policy judgment, okay? that I would have at least one of those cards in most of these 2ACs, given the prevalence right now of kind of negative arguments that say, well, fiat is illusory, imagined. There's a big run on kind of, very classic, takes out the entire case because, not real, etc. Like, you need some kind of card that explains why it is that we should deal with these things in terms of political imagination, okay? Alternative solvency arguments. They need to be made both about the case impact, okay, something that is frequent, and about their impact, okay? So like, it should not only be that you are making alternative solvency arguments about the case, you need to make some alternative solvency arguments about their impact. If you are spotting every one of these security teams, right, or somebody reading the race K of national security, for instance, right? If you spot them every time that the alternative, quote, solves the anti-Black foundations of the world, right, or of the international system, that's a big problem for you, okay? You cannot think about alternative solvency arguments only in terms of your case, okay? Impact arguments. Everybody is addicted to only making magnitude comparisons, right? How many of you, your favorite K2AR is existential risk outweighs? Raise your hand. Or like have made that set of impact arguments, like that's the focus of impact strategy on the app, yeah? We are aware of this trend. Okay. You need to think about a wider variety of that set of impact arguments, given that there are many different cases, particularly on this topic, where making their impact argument existential, not difficult at all, right? If you think about any of the kind of neoliberalism arguments that you will debate, any of the things that I just mentioned about kind of the any of these arguments about the international system is actually a race war or a war between the North and South, there's an ongoing war, right? All of these are arguments that essentially can be easily characterized as the same magnitude. You need to make some arguments about time frame, about probability, impact comparison that has a little bit more variety than just magnitude, right? There are a number of critiques that can be designed solely around the ways in which how we understand existential risk is, needs to be problematized. So like, if you go look at some of the Anthropocene or planet politics stuff in the IR area, all of that is designed around the ways in which we conceive of existential risk right now are fundamentally flawed. So putting all your eggs in the magnitude basket, okay, that very easy to plan for on the part of the neg. Part of what we were saying about kind of getting the neg off of their blocks sometimes, right? If you make the same 5 arguments every time that you see everybody else making, the neg's preparation for that is, should be basically like locked down, solid gold, ready to go. You got to add a little bit of variety there. Okay, want to leave a little bit of time for questions. And kind of, I had to speed through some of the stuff there at the end because I obviously wanted to spend a lot of time on cross-ex and alternative stuff. Let's see what else we got. Robbie, yeah.
So I know this is like this. I've seen that a lot of lectures are centered around like Afro-pessimism in the context. So do you think that race case will be race IRKs will be a big part in this topic this year?
I would say yes, if only because I think there's a pretty good opportunity for the neg on one. You can read arguments about race that are not pessimism, and most people are prepared to debate pessimism as opposed to what is the role that race plays in international relations. Okay. Second, there are a number of articles and kind of people who have written some of the race and IR material recently that, because the NATO, North Atlantic Treaty Organization, okay, if you think about the set of people writing about the role of the Atlantic or Black Atlantic in our understanding of world history, there are a lot of people who make some of those connections. And so it's not that hard to find that set of cards.
Okay, all right, yeah, that would make sense.
Yeah, there's some good stuff out there on that.
Sure. So in a lot of rounds, we usually read scenario planning or cards like that, basically, or I don't know, I guess in Africa rounds that are Gordon, all these things, but all these sort of ones that tack pieces of the critique, how should they play into deeper one-on-one career strategies coming out of the 2AC?
Yeah, I think that a number of those cards about predictions or scenario planning, not very helpful. I think that those are largely appreciated or kind of win debates in front of judges who already if that's the card that person would have read, sure. But part of the reason that I'm a little bit skeptical about that set of cards as a, ultimate winning strategy is that they're not really, I mean, for one, do you see how they also sort of repeat the plan focus thing? It's like, what you're really saying there is, well, we need to make specific kind of assessments or predictions of consequences of particular actions. Yeah. Okay. We've already got that argument. If we're duplicating that with another card, I don't really know what that gets us, that the negative answers to one don't answer the other. So if they are successfully responding to your framework argument, that automatically means that they are also responding to your scenario planning argument. Yeah. I just don't think that it gives us much variety. So that's kind of one of those that like, it shows up in so many 2ACs, but it's never really clear to me exactly where it's going or why it's there. Okay. So like one of the things that this is really about is just kind of culling the, well, I always, I put this in every K2AC. Do I know how it applies or exactly what the point of offense is? Not so much, but like it's a card and cards are helpful for winning these debates. So that's kind of a place where I would try and ask yourself, like, rather than thinking of this as modeling, like most, if I'm being honest, like I think most K2ACs are not great. Like it's not an area where people like to do a lot of prep. Like I'm going to guess that that's not the set of 2ACs that you all are most excited to write, right? They tend to be complicated. They're difficult to understand. The cards that you're trying to find are oftentimes very difficult to find as well because the lack of communication between some of the areas that the AF is discussing and the neg is discussing, right? And so think about all of these 2AC blocks as sort of like, in order for this card to live here, I have to be able to explain and justify it to myself rather than see that other people have done this same thing, okay? So like that, I know that doesn't provide, it's like, that's sort of the opposite. I have just rejected the premise of your question, which is the like, how do we make this apply in all of the circumstances? It's like, I don't really think that you will, okay? The other thing that's going on here is like, I know Truth is offering a Russian history elective, right? But like, here are some things that you need to understand about Russia. I'd put that a lot more, like if I'm really thinking about what it's like to prepare to debate, kind of international relations, security case stuff on this topic. Yeah. Honestly, I'm going to spend the month before the season, like there's a fair amount of like Russia nonfiction that's going to be on my list because to really make any of the arguments that are, if you think about the general theoretical claim that you just asked about, which is scenario planning, right? Or predictions or like empirical observation should be privileged over a, kind of general theoretical indite, right? Some of these arguments that come up very frequently in these debates, yeah? Like those theoretical cards on scenario planning, I don't think are ever going to get you as far as sounding like you know what the hell you're talking about on Russia. Like that's a set of historical information that doesn't easily translate into cards, but translates a lot into support for a number of claims that you basically have to win in that debate. So if you plan on a 2AR that's like, we need to make very specific empirical observations about Russian behavior in order to understand and respond appropriately in terms of NATO security policy, you better know all of that set of, like that's the part where if you get kind of called on, you're in trouble, right? If you don't know it. Secondly, if you think about the set of negative cards that we often see that are just like, here's this kind of historical backdrop for NATO, right? But like, if you think of the neoliberalism cards with relation to NATO, right? But like, this is a security alliance founded on kind of the continuation of free market liberalism, et cetera, right? If you don't understand some of the historical justifications for the grand strategy of free market liberalism, right? The like that set of stuff that we were going over in the Brooks lecture, like it just doesn't matter if you've read a card that we need specific scenario planning, right? The negative is going to use a lot of that kind of like, most often I see the neg get away with kind of, well, we have a card that mentions 4 or 5 kind of historical examples, or like here are problems with NATO's past policy, or here are elements of historical injustice that are connected to the international system. Like if you think about it as we've let the negatives burden be, they have pointed out that there are elements of historical injustice in the formation and kind of background of NATO policy. It's like, yeah, that's not a surprise. That is not a difficult threshold to meet, right? So the real answer that you need there is the like, why are we working in a circumstance that is not the best case scenario? Rather than reading a like predictions card, I would want a card that says kind of why we need to think about international or kind of foreign policy from the perspective primarily of a political ethics instead of ethics first. Like, yes, many of these outcomes or, you know, the inputs here are unjust. We can't get rid of the phenomenon of historical injustice. We have to respond to it in, you know, particular instances or circumstances. Those are the kind of cards that I would want that are responses to the negatives framework, but that I rarely see read. Okay, it's just like any framework argument that is about, like, if you think about the kind of, you know, the role of the judges, when you were talking about role of judges to, you know, reject the economic exploitation of capitalism in the debate, right? You can read cards that say essentially the like ethical condemnation or judgment of capitalism is politically useless. We're just like, we know that elements of capitalism are exploitative. That doesn't answer any important questions about what to do about it. That's the kind of card that you could read that kind of does respond to the actual claim that's being made there. Scenario planning is not going to help. The negative impacts can just as easily be characterized as a scenario, right? Like you can understand the ways in which capitalism unsustainable meets the criteria of scenario planning. Layla, what were you gonna say?
In the event that, like, just for like diversification of arguments, in the event that they're reading like gate law, like the 2AC is like obviously very time pressured. Like what, I mean, I know it varies a lot from like between specific case, but like, what do you think like must be in the 2AC so you have that opportunity if they end up going for the K in the block?
I mean, you've got to have, so for one, you need to have short and long versions of your blocks, right? So like, there are two phenomena that I see a lot. One is the like, oh, this was a 2AC that was clearly designed to be like 7 minutes long. And, you know, now the person is adjusting it on the fly to be a minute and a half, right? Or like a minute 15. You don't want to make that adjustment on the fly. You want to have the kind of basis for here's the shorter version, here's the longer version. Usually that's because a lot of, you know, the critical cards tend to be longer, right? So that's the place where instead of highlighting, like the other response that I'll see here is the taking that same 8-minute 2AC and then essentially highlighting like 2 sentences per card. So now it's a minute and a half. No, make some decisions about prioritizing which cards you actually need in the debate versus the analytical arguments that you can read in detail, right? So set up, like have a version of that that permits you to read 1 or 2 of those cards in the 1AR. Ideally, you would have some 1AR versions of those cards that are shorter, okay? I think that, you know, just like what you want to have, you know, part of the reason that I was describing this is like, you want theoretical defense of plan focus or some kind of theoretical argument to say like, you know, we're back in the realm of, you know, what the 1AC was likely set up to debate, okay? You need the defense of background assumptions. So like here I would get engaged on the liberalism, security, community style stuff. If I would make them kind of go through, or it's likely to be the case anyway, that it's like the neg's going to set up their strategies to deal with NATO, right? Or quote, tech or technology. Those are the 2 major forks that I would have some, you know, some of those background assumptions that I could defend in either case, okay? I would have a way to explain a permutation that is not, as I said, premised on winning plan focus. So like, that's something that I'm likely writing out based upon the alternative. I would have alternative solvency arguments that are about the case impact, and then I would have alternative solvency arguments that are about their impact.